We have got a lot of questions, so we'll get to that. We'll get to those just a second. I want to have a couple of things to mention. One, this whole program is the result of a lot of hard work from folks like Chris Glenn, who does our education program, to all the folks who've been answering questions and monitoring chats and promoting it. Catherine Wall, Doug Ruin, Tim Alderton, Arlene Calhoun, Dennis Carey, just everybody. You see them on here. They've been really on the ball and fantastic at making this happen and making all of our online programming happen. We're very committed to this online programming. We will continue it even once everything is back to normal, because we're finding so many people are really interested in this. Today we had 4 times as many people participate as we could have had if we were live. And we can do that because we have fantastic members. I would love to encourage all of y'all to consider being a member. We have great programs. In 2 weeks on Saturday, we're going to have our winter symposium, which is going to be a lot of fun. Eat, drink, and be merry. Chocolate tequila and the intersection of plants and people. It's going to be a lot of fun. You can go to our website and sign up for that. But I do encourage you to consider being a member, because that's really how we stay open and keep doing these things. Again, want to thank Leaf and Limb for sponsoring this particular program. There also will be an evaluation that gets dropped into the chat so that you can evaluate this program. We can make it even better for y'all. So now I'm going to get into some questions. Let's see. The question, well, I'll answer this real quick. How can I buy your book? Not on Amazon. Go straight to UNC Press and you can pre-order it. It comes out in March, but you can pre-order it now from UNC Press.
I'll drop the link in the chat, Mark, if that's okay.
Perfect. There's some of the questions kind of interact with all 3 of y'all. So let me start doing those with some mulch. There are a lot of mulch questions. Concern about how deep should you do your mulch? Can you do it too deep? How do you mulch under trees? What does that do for the ground pollinators?
That is all 3.
Yes.
Well, in general, just general mulching, not trees notwithstanding or anything like that, you don't need but 2 to 4 inches of mulch. You don't need to go 6 or 8 or 12 inches of mulch. The mulch is supposed to ameliorate the temperatures and the water going through and reduce the water loss. And so what you need is the spaces in between these particles which act as the barrier. It's not the barrier itself, the material, it's the spaces in between that's important. And so you don't need but 2 to 4 inches of that material. If it is a coarse material, you can put a little bit deeper if you'd like. But if it's fine material, it will tend to slow down gas exchange if it gets too deep. And of course, if you're talking about, I'm not talking about trees, whatever, that's a whole nother story when you're underneath trees. And I won't speak to that per se. We'll let Basil talk about that.
Can I throw something in here? Something I tell people, and I want to get y'all's opinion on this, is here in the South, especially where we're not worried about frost heaving and things like that, is I tell people their mulch should be thick enough to keep light from hitting the ground. So annual weed seeds don't germinate, but thin enough, but as thin as you can get it. Other than that, just for mulching purposes, because that will keep the soil keep moisture at that mulch soil interface, which is what you want. You don't want if your mulch is too thick and stays wet, the weed seeds just grow in it. But if your mulch dries out, but under that it stays moist. So what do y'all think with that? And we've got a lot of questions, so we'll try and hit these pretty quickly. Basil, you have any thoughts? And then Danesha.
Yeah, one really important thing about mulch is, y'all, with trees, especially the triple shreds, they tend to get what's called hydrophobic on the top. It's just a fancy term for waterproof. So if you're going to use your designer mulches, triple shreds, double shreds, a lot of that, then you do need to go out there every 6 months, use a potato hoe or something to turn it over, because otherwise it'll start actually repelling water. You won't have that problem with wood chips. I recognize not everybody wants wood chips, so just watch out for waterproof mulch.
And I'll just mention in terms of the bees actually prefer areas that are sunny to make their nest areas. And so if you're under a tree, particularly if it's quite shady, you don't have to worry about the bees in those areas.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask the rest of my staff to help me out with some of the questions because there are a lot of them. I want to hit the ones that kind of are things people kept coming back to. There have been several questions, again, about soil mulches and soil additives, bagged products. People are concerned with heavy metals in them or other toxicities. Any thoughts on that?
Well, heavy metals can be a concern in mulches, but what it usually stems from are people have been using pressure treated wood that has the old type had cadmium and arsenic and copper in it. If you kept it in the board form, it's perfectly fine, but if you grind it up, it leaches out and gets into the soil. And so if you're not careful in your mulch selection, you could have people throwing away their old fences or their old decks. There's about 1 billion board feet of this material that's still out there. They've changed the way that they impregnate the material now, so they don't use the same thing. It's more copper than anything else. But there's a bunch of it out there, and it can be a problem. And in fact, we've shown when we did a survey of mulches, we find anywhere from 10 to 40% of the samples that we get would have had some of this material in it. And this was 10 years ago. Even though all the box stores and all the people that have made people sign things that they say, we don't carry that in there, indeed, some of it does get in. Now, not to be self-serving, but certified material by the Mulch and Soil Council have all been tested for that, and they test specifically for heavy metals in this material. And so if you get certified material, then you don't tend to have that at all. If you get fresh material, and if it's bark-based mostly, then you don't have to worry about it. But a lot of mulches today are wood-based, and I'm not saying that those are bad. They take trees and they just shred the whole thing, and they turn them into mulch. I mean, they make good mulches, provided they're regular trees. But if they grind up any of these old materials, they should be separated. They should not be in the process, but it's problematic. If you've got mulches that have square edges, that could be wood that might have been pressure treated, certainly from old lumber and things like that. So it's not as big a concern today as it used to be, but if you're concerned about it, you can check with the manufacturers or just check to see if they are actually certified materials.
Or just get leaves. Everybody throws them by their curb every year. They're free. There's tons of them out there. I collect all my neighbors' leaves every year for mulch. And then you can also get wood chips. I know that's not going to work everywhere, but there's a lot of times where there's free carbon, free mulches out there where maybe, I love this, and I'll just say it again from earlier, but you get your leaves, get your wood chips underneath, and if you want that designer look, you can put a little sprinkling of pine straw on the top or something like that.
Yeah. And when you get those chips from, chipdrop.com or one of those groups, like from something from Basil or from another arborist, those guys are not throwing old lumber through their chippers to screws and things like that that'll ruin their equipment. They're not doing that. So you won't get that. I will say, though, I have seen at a local big box store bags of very cheap mulch called No Float Cypress, I think they're calling it. And if you look in there, sometimes you can see painted pieces of lumber. That stuff everything is going through there. So you want to be really careful about that. There's a question about Carolina jessamine. Is that really toxic to bees?
That's a question I've only gotten once before, and I really need to do a little bit more literature searching on it, but I do not believe that it is actually toxic to bees. But I am kind of caught on my back foot right now. But I think that's an urban myth. I don't think that it's toxic to bees.
You're right. It's not toxic. I happen to know that one.
Good. Thank you. It takes a team effort, doesn't it? There's so much to remember.
Yeah, there's just information all over the place about that. There's a question about, you talked a lot about plants that do well in sun for pollinators. Not everybody has sun or well-drained soils. There were a couple that our staff put in there, like buttonbush, white bracted seds, the Rhynchospora, Ilex glabra, Ilex verticillata, Eryngium, Stokesia. Do you have any other thoughts on that? Or did I just rail off all the easy ones for you?
For shade-loving pollinator plants?
Shade or moisture.
hellebores, one of my very, very favorites. In fact, mine are blooming right now. They make great bee habitat. I'm trying to think. I have a whole list, and I didn't have time to talk about them today. But hellebores are one of my favorites, and some of the others that you mentioned, Mark. But if anyone wants like my entire list of shade-loving pollinator plants, they're welcome to email me.
Okay, while I have an expert on, again, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to say something that I tell people all the time, and I'm willing to take an online recorded correction having to do with pollinators. We have beehives at the Arboretum, and some people put sugar water out during the winter for their bees because there's nothing flowering. We don't do that. Our beekeeper takes honey off the hives during the winter, and that's because we have so much flowering. And I often tell people, if they want to support the bees and the wildlife, to concentrate less on the lists, not to say that there's anything wrong with the list when you really want to help them out, but to plant a wide diversity of plants, because we can take honey off our beehives during the winter because we have something in flower like hellebores all year round. There is something flowering every single day here. And if it's warm, as it is often in the South in the middle of winter, the bees are out and are active.
So I agree. Again, I'm not a beekeeper, right? My area is horticulture and plants for bees. But I think that most beekeepers feel comfortable supplementing with sugar water, but I think the old school beekeepers say that it's not necessary and it can actually be damaging to the hive. I think everyone has to understand, if they're going to supplement, it's because they don't have other forage available. So what I would recommend is, I don't want to say, well, don't supplement your bees. I don't want anybody's bees to starve, but what I would say is just plant, your very favorite plants from a list or just from what you've seen blooming in the landscape, and then you don't have to supplement your bees with sugar water.
Yeah. My question was less about the supplementing and more about the importance of planting a diversity.
Oh, well,
don't work, but other things will.
I tell people it's a lot like if I gave my son the option of eating ice cream or French fries every day for, a year, would he choose that? Yes, he probably would. Would it be good for him? No, it would not. It's the same with the bees, right? The more diverse flowers and plants that you have that provide habitat and forage, the better healthy your bees are going to be, the better healthy your landscape is going to be.
And the same is true for trees. That diversity is so key. When you have canopy, you really do want a diversity of species, understory, overstory. And I'll also add that when it comes to trees, we don't want to forget that trees and shrubs are huge pollinators too. Oaks and tulip flowers, all these other trees that we see every day, thousands of bees are feeding from those during the right times of the year. We just can't see it as easily because it's so high up.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth mentioning that we're talking about pollinators quite a bit, but the big overstory trees, the smaller understory, the shrubs, the perennials also provide food for other critters, birds, mammals, and habitat for those. I mean, that was Danesha mentioned that some, that you want to leave some of those grasses and stalks of plants, those little hollow stalks of plants, we leave them up for the birds to eat the seeds at the top, but really in those stems, we have solitary bees sometimes are in there. So, don't be too clean with all of your garden. Maybe have some areas where you don't clean up from winter so early. Speaking of critters, there's a question about voles in mulch. Thoughts on that?
You said voles?
Yes.
Well, there's a couple of things about mulches about that. Voles, and the other question I get is termites sometimes as issues. And you can have both in mulches. If the mulch is pretty thick, you tend to have more of those. And the recommendation for mulches, as far as termites are concerned, is to leave a gap between, you don't mulch up against to the side of your house, because if you do that, then the termites can literally go from the mulch right into the house itself. So you always leave a small gap, anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 inches away from the actual house itself for your mulches, and then you won't have that in there. And also, voles tend to stay a little more, I tend to have bigger problem. If you till your garden up. And if you till up your entire yard, I didn't have voles in my yard until I tilled up 6 inches my entire yard. And then everything was soft and smushy. And then I made more space for them. So you do have to be careful in this process. You can get some voles in there. So I would just be careful but it's not necessarily a major issue. And neither are termites that much in that same thing.
And if you leave some good, healthy trees around those hawks, they love the voles.
Well, and if you have cats or hawks or birds like that, you feed them really easily. So.
Yeah. So I want to thank, we've had a couple people who've already come in with memberships who've been participating. So I do want to thank those folks. Let's see.
Dennis has posted a question in the Q&A from YouTube, Mark. He has said it's for Bill. Someone would like to have him address the value of sheet mulching versus tilling the organic matter in. I guess pluses and minuses for both.
Well, what I didn't say was, if we use the term no-till, no-tilling in a garden is not an issue or question. No-till for farming is saving your soil. And so the thing about no-till is, and on agriculture, is you're saving soil because every time you turn it over, you're blowing it away and you're losing it. And since it takes so long to make soil, anytime you disturb it, you can lose it. And when you're doing hundreds and thousands of acres, that could be a problem. But in your soil, number one, you don't actually have soil. You have subsoil to start with. Two, you're trying to build it. So incorporating into it and tilling that over is not a bad or an unsustainable practice. In fact, you don't have good soil, so you're trying to make it. So tilling it initially, in my mind, there's no issues as far as saving the planet or being a bad practice. However, putting sheet mulch down and not going into the soil works just as well. And if you do, it just takes a little longer. You can still grow in it. Your mulch is your soil system's about this deep, and you can plant in it. You just don't plant right away in it. You wait over through the winter, the fall and the winter, and you pull the mulch back a little bit, and then you plant directly in it, and you can work. It's simply a labor-saving device, and there are a lot of people that love to garden, that particularly as you get older, you can't. You don't have quite the same month you had when you were in your 20s and 30s. So it's a very viable practice. I wouldn't have recommended it 20 years ago, but then I didn't know much about it. But today, putting it on top in an area is relatively easy. It's a quick way to do it. And there's nothing there. It's not a bad practice in any way, shape, or form. So it just gives you another option for that. And if you put some sides around that sheet mulching type of thing, you've got a raised bed. And raised beds are always good. So what I'm saying is you got many different options to it. I just wouldn't take a tree and put it on top because you're just asking for problems. So you've got to go to the regular arboricultural practice of planting trees in the proper way. But for everything else, either one actually works. And they work both very well.
And I would also add a nice little application of this is if you do have trees and shrubs in your yard and you want to do a quick mulch ring around those, we're all getting tons of boxes from Amazon. Take off that packaging tape, open up the boxes, lay it down around the tree or the shrub, put your mulch on top, and now you get free weed control for a while, 6 months or so. And you're getting that mulch established. And now you're well on your way to what Bill's talking about, building that healthy soil ecosystem. And you get the weed control.
Right. And the thing that I loved about the sheet mulching is the question, when people ask about, how do I improve my soil? They're always told, till up 6 inches, put the organic matter in, do all that. Well, most gardeners, and I include myself in there, you move into a new house, you want to start gardening, you're furnishing the house, or, you're young or whatever, and you don't have the disposable income or the time. You may have young kids to do all that. And so you start planting, or you have a wooded lot already. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, you're like, I wish I had done more with my soil, but it's all planted. I can't till everything up. I've got roots. The sheet mulching you can do over and around existing plants and build soil in existing beds. Sometimes you may need to dig up perennials or things to raise their level. You need to make sure you're not piling up around the tree trunks and things like Basil mentioned, and that goes for the shrubs as well. But it's a way to come into an existing garden and go. There was a couple questions about wood products. One, and probably we can have, well, two different people answer. One was about bee houses. Do you want to be careful about what you're using for bee houses in terms of wood, lumber, and same for raised beds? So Danesha, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. You don't want to use treated wood, right? And so when I'm building bee houses, I usually just go sort of forage in the detritus in my backyard. I have a number of oak trees, living here in Raleigh, we have a lot of oak trees that drop twigs and stems, and we usually just use those. But I think, Bill and Basil probably know more about the treated lumber, but I just know that you're not supposed to use treated lumber for raised beds because of the heavy metals, I guess. And I would agree, don't use treated lumber for bee houses either.
Well, in raised beds, treated lumber in itself is not necessarily a damaging process as long as you don't grind it up. You can take treated lumber, particularly the ones that are treated today, which are mostly a copper material rather than have arsenic in it. And as long as you keep them whole, you can make fence posts out of them and you can use them that way, and they still work fine. The problem is when you grind that stuff up. So if you use old railroad ties, for example, they've been treated with some really nasty stuff in the old days. But so making raised beds, treated lumber isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. And if you put up sides, in other words, they're going to eventually break down if you don't do that. So I'm not opposed to treated lumber as long as you're not grinding up the materials when you get done. You need to dispose of them, and you can still take those to special places when you get done with them and use them. It's only when you grind them up. So don't cut them. Don't cut them and break them all apart and then use any of that. That's never a good sign.
Well, thanks, Bill. It just goes to show you learn something new every day.
Well, they still use treated lumber in marine applications and everything else, and they're all very conscious about what the issues are. And when you start measuring these levels, you find out that as long as it stays in the board, no one says treated lumber is a bad thing. It's the disposing of treated lumber that's always the bad thing, and that's the biggest issue.
All right. Is there anything that, that comes to mind for any of you from these questions or from something somebody else talked about that you want to add that we may have missed?
My one kind of final parting comment is I think, there's a lot of inspiration we can get just by looking at nature. I think oftentimes if you're in doubt about what to do, go find that ecosystem nearby. There are woods and fields, and these habitats exist everywhere, and they do great without human intervention. They don't need chemicals. They don't need us fussing about. Messy is not a bad thing. These are how landscapes work. So look to the forest and look to the fields and look to ecosystems for inspiration on how to go about doing a healthy landscape.
Oh, absolutely. And to that point, the things we talked about building soils is not that you're taking something that's actually natural and doing it better, because we've actually removed that natural stuff that's been there for a long time, and now we have to make something better. My last thought is about incorporation. And the sheet stuff is great, raised beds or stuff. But if you're going to till materials in, part of the issue is tillers sometimes are expensive and you don't have it. But I will tell you that it is great to own a tiller, but the thing that's actually better than having your own tiller is having a neighbor with a tiller. And everybody that has a tiller is more than happy to help because they don't use it very often. And so I used to help people. I'd say, no, you can't just borrow my tiller, but I'll come and till it up for you because I just like to use it. So, so find your neighbors with them. And gardeners are always happy to help each other. So I think it's just a wonderful thing.
Thank you all so much. This has been amazing. I would really encourage everybody to check out these resources. NC State University has just a wealth of resources on pollinators, on soils, real national leaders. I mentioned before, Leaf and Limb, their website and their newsletter is phenomenal. It really is good. You can sense the love for what they're doing through their website at Leaf and Limb. I want to thank them again for sponsoring us. Danesha also has the book coming out, pre-order through UNC Press. It's fantastic. I've seen some early bits of it. I can't wait to get my own. We do have a link for the evaluation form, please give that to us. We love to get better. Our speakers all love to get better. Love that. Check our website for upcoming programs. We have a lot that's happening online for adults, for kids. It's amazing, especially our winter symposium is going to be big fun in 2 weeks from now. We just don't have time for all of the questions, but Leaf and Limb, they're great about answering things. I send questions to Basil all the time. Danesha and Bill are just like everybody at NC State in the horticulture department. They are there. The students are what people think about, but they are dedicated to the idea of extension through land-grant universities, and they will answer questions and help you out. There's a list of everybody on there, so please join that. And thank you to the folks who joined today and who have joined recently. And thanks to those of you who have been members for a long time. We all appreciate you. I know we hit at some point pretty close to 600 between Zoom and YouTube. So y'all have really spread the word widely. So thanks again, everybody. And we look forward to talking with all the participants down the road. Thanks, guys. Now get out and garden. What I'm going to do.